Welcome to Diplomacy Podcast. Today I'm going to talk about energy, Cyprus, and the real map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Let's start with a heresy for anyone raised on the usual eternal rivalry narratives. When we talk strictly about energy, Turkey and Greece often have overlapping interests. If your mental map is pipelines and power lines rather than flags, this becomes obvious. Producers to the east, Russia and Azerbaijan, and the Caspian Basin beyond, reach European demand largely through Anatolia into Greece, then onward into the EU. TANAP feeds TAP across northern Greece into Italy. Turk Stream brings Russian molecules to Thrace and onward. In other words, the energy geography already binds Turkey and Greece more than it separates them. Infrastructure doesn't care about slogans. It follows physics, cost, and geography. But the moment you insert the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriot administration, into that equation, the math changes. Legal narratives harden, emotions spike, and suddenly technocratic cooperation turns into a sovereignty referendum. The rhetorical move you often hear in European forums is that Turkey is an occupying force on the island. That single sentence compresses decades, erases the security arrangements and the 1974 context, and resets the frame. Anything Ankara does becomes negation, not policy. There is also an energy myth worth bearing. A decade ago, the EastMed conversation was saturated with breathless claims. These fields will shift global balances. That was marketing theater. The realized and probable reserves, especially of Cyprus, are not the scale that justify a multi-billion euro ultra deepwater pipeline to southern Europe that bypasses Turkey. The economics don't clear. The Leviathan field offshore Israel is real and monetized. Zohr offshore Egypt is large and meaningful for Cairo. But Cypriot finds are mostly modest by global standards. Those molecules make sense in the region, not across oceans, particularly when LNG giants like Qatar and Australia and the surge of American LNG already crowd the global market. In short, regional gas is profitable when it stays regional. That helps explain Ankara's tonal shift. At one point, Turkey signaled with Navteg's advisories, seismic ships, and naval shadows that it would not be excluded from the map. Then, after a period of signaling and standoffs, Girit, Libya's maritime deal, and occasional near misses with European navies, the posture softened. Critics said we pulled back the vessels, see? But a cooler reading is that the cost benefit changed. The gas wasn't the prize people imagined, and Karadeniz's discoveries rebalanced Ankara's attention. Meanwhile, the diplomatic oxygen needed for Ukraine, the South Caucasus, and domestic priorities made perpetual brinkmanship in the Eastern Med look like a luxury. Let's zoom out. For decades, Turkey Greece was mostly an Aegean boxed story. Continental shelf disputes, airspace tactical games, demilitarization of certain islands. It was a repeatable, contained drama. Around 2016 to 2020, the theater expanded. Add Israel, Egypt, and the EU. Add Libya's factions and the American and French presence by exercise. Add the discourse of exclusive economic zones EEZs over very small islands with very large legal consequences. The story left the Aegean and spilled into the Eastern Mediterranean, exactly where Ankara is most sensitive to being internationalized. Greece has long pursued a strategy of moving the problem onto bigger tables EU, NATO, and international courts, where asymmetries of size, economy, and military weigh less than law and allies. That's smart statecraft for a smaller country. but it also locks both sides into performative cycles where no one can admit the obvious. The only durable answers come from local bargains that stick even when big powers change their minds. Now to Cyprus, the gravitational center of the whole problem. Here's a blunt assessment. A perfect solution that satisfies everyone does not exist. The Annan Plan era showed how contingent progress was on a different Turkey EU horizon. Had Turkey been on an EU entry track in the 2000s, a federal solution under an EU umbrella might have been feasible because trust and enforcement could have been outsourced to Brussels. That world is gone. What we have instead is a stable instability. The north tethered to Turkey, the south anchored in the EU, a dense cross border everyday economy, and an international environment that tolerates ambiguity so long as it avoids war. Energy didn't unlock Cyprus, it complicated it. The Cypriot gas story amplified the hardest legal questions: who licenses, who shares revenue, and whether a potential two state stance implicitly assigns most subsea floor wealth to the south. Turkey's position has been consistent in one respect. Any development must be equitable and inclusive of Turkish Cypriots. In practice, that means either a comprehensive political arrangement with guaranteed revenue sharing and governance, or a moratorium on unilateral moves that harden facts while talks go nowhere. Neither track has real momentum right now. Let's talk about consistency versus flexibility. Commentary often says Greece is consistent, Turkey zigzags. There's a kernel of truth. Athens has invested in lawfare, maps, and patient dossier building since the 1970s, leveraging EU membership to anchor its claims. Ankara's approach is more elastic, assertive phases and reset phases, shifting talking points as the regional balance changes. Yet, elasticity is not necessarily incoherence. It can be strategic triage, choosing when to press, when to bank gains, and when to deprioritize a secondary theater in order to handle primary ones. Consider Libya's 2019 Maritime Memorandum. It was legally contested internationally, but tactically transformative. It punctured the idea of a Greek Cyprus Israel corridor that totally bypassed Turkish claims, and it forced every conversation afterward to account for Ankara's lines. You don't need to like it to admit it was effective. A short historical detour clarifies the present. After 1974, Washington tried to manage Aegean balances with a 7 to 10 defense aid ratio favoring Greece. That formula is long dead. The real asymmetry today is larger. Turkey's strategic bandwidth, from northern Syria to the Caucasus, from the Black Sea to the Balkans, is orders of magnitude bigger than Greece's. That makes Greek politics more inclined to internationalize disputes and more sensitive to Turkish messaging, especially when public rhetoric in Ankara leans martial. If you live in Athens or on a small island within sight of Anatolia, it's not an abstraction, it's horizon lines and radar screens. When Turkish officials or television studios say we'll be in Athens in 24 hours, it lands. It convinces moderates that consistency against Turkey is prudent, even if the same citizens privately admit their economy benefits enormously when Turks vacation on their islands. Fear travels faster than ferry boats. So, if hardline signaling entrenches fear, what opens space? Compartmentalization. Take issues that can be decoupled from sovereignty and triage them: wildfire cooperation, earthquake response, maritime search and rescue drills, ferry links, and visa facilitation. electricity interconnectors that reduce island diesel dependence, and tourism flows that finance municipal budgets in the Cyclades and the Dodecanese. For 20 years, operational professionals have done this in fits and starts. Whenever media attention drifts and militaries stop shadowing each other, pragmatism refills the cracks. This is not naive. It's the logic of resilient peace. Don't aim for grand bargains first. Stack small, bankable wins until the cost of blowing them up is politically prohibitive. What about the EastMed pipeline, the poster child for grand bargains? If we strip mythology, we get three numbers: volume, distance, capex. The volumes offshore Cyprus do not justify the distance and capital expenditure without Turkish territory and infrastructure, or without an LNG work around in Egypt that still depends on Egyptian fiscal health and stable security. That's why the once loud pipeline idea keeps shrinking in serious energy circles. It's also why Ankara and Athens can quietly see the same map: more gas through Turkey, more onward flows through Greece. Energy, properly understood, is a relationship, not a trophy. And yet, specific steps keep fraying because the third point on the triangle, Brussels, can't ignore member state pressure from Nicosia and Athens. When the Commission or Parliament echoes maximalist Greek or Greek Cypriot legal framing, Ankara hears it as legitimacy theft. Conversely, when Turkey sends a seismic vessel near a contested block, Nicosia sees it as coercion by survey. This is the stalemate in miniature. Europe tends to legalize political preferences. Turkey tends to politicize legal geography. Let me give a concrete Black Sea example to contrast. When Russia's war in Ukraine shifted the entire region's logistics, the United States and NATO reimagined supply lines through Alexandroupoli in Greece to bypass the Montreux constraints on the Turkish straits. That wasn't an anti Turkey move, it was a wartime workaround. But it had side effects. Athens felt more indispensable. Ankara felt pressure to demonstrate its own indispensability. Grain corridor diplomacy, Bayraktar deterrence math, and a careful Montreux posture that reminded everyone that in this region nothing moves without Turkey. The lesson isn't that the allies are fickle, it's that regional architecture is path dependent. Create one corridor and you must rebalance in three other places. Greece gained a NATO logistics spotlight. Turkey reminded the system it holds the hinge. Where does that leave Cyprus? In a truth few want to say plainly. The island already lives a de facto two entity reality and a de jure one and a half reality. The north functions with Ankara, the south legislates with the EU. The most realistic horizon is not a one signing solves all outcome, but a managed coexistence that gradually thickens economic and civic links under firm security guarantees. Revenue sharing escrow models for any future offshore development, joint committees for environmental and safety oversight, EU funded infrastructure that is agnostic to flags but concrete in benefits. These are boring, durable steps. They don't satisfy maximalists. They do change lives. Let's also puncture a second myth that Turkey's pullback in the eastern Mediterranean was a capitulation. Look at the opportunity cost ledger. Karadeniz gas cohered into a national narrative with immediate industrial upside. The South Caucasus normalization created leverage with both Baku and Yerevan that spills into connectivity through Nakhchivan and potentially onward to Central Asia. The Syrian and Iraqi files remain urgent and kinetic. Each of these theaters pays more strategic rent per unit of political energy than a standoff with frigates over a field that cannot clear its own capital expenditure hurdle. You don't get points for winning arguments with physics. What then are the actionable steps that fit this reality? First, codify compartmentalization. Create an annual Turkey-Greece practicalities docket with public scorecards, wildfires, SAR, ferry links, grid pilots for islands, and joint disaster drills. Publish completion rates. Make it boring. Bureaucracies love checklists. Let them. Second, insulate energy from theatrics. Accept the market verdict. Most EastMed molecules that move will do so either via Turkey's network or via Egyptian LNG facilities. Build commercial consortia that include both Turkish and Greek companies where possible and design revenue sharing schemes that assume a Cyprus stalemate, not a miracle. Third, de-risk Cyprus by rewarding restraint. When either side avoids provocative licensing or patrol patterns for, say, 6 months, unlock EU funds for island wide environmental upgrades, wastewater renewables, interconnectors that reduce diesel. Tie money to calm. It's amazing how often budgets beat flags. Fourth, prep for court without living in court. Quietly assemble what each side would accept if an international tribunal were asked to draw lines with equity and proportionality. Don't rush there, but don't improvise if you arrive. The worst outcomes happen when legal teams meet for the first time after a crisis. Fifth, speak to fear honestly. Turkish politics should acknowledge Greek public anxiety without sarcasm. Greek politics should acknowledge the scale asymmetry without moralizing. We will never be safe until we win every map. And we will never compromise because power are both sentences that lead to dead ends. There's also a generational element. Younger Turks and Greeks already live a thin version of the future on holiday ferries and Instagram itineraries. Every long weekend, when 2 million Turks float the Aegean Islands, municipal budgets in Greece breathe easier. Every time Greeks crowd the Grand Bazaar and the Karakay waterfront, small businesses in Istanbul get another week's payroll. You don't solve sovereignty by ordering octopus, but you do increase the price of conflict when the alternative has a face and a tip jar. Let's close where we began, with maps. In energy, the real maps are not the ones that go viral on talk shows, the ones with cartoonish ribbons and exaggerated ease polygons around tiny islets. The real maps are spreadsheets. Cost of steel per kilometer, seabed slope percentages, interest rates on project finance, expected decline curves, and end market elasticities. Those maps say Turkey and Greece rise together when they move molecules together, and that any EastMed project that pretends otherwise is either a press release or a provocation. When those same spreadsheets meet the political map of Cyprus, they also say manage expectations, bank small gains, and refuse to give maximalists the win they crave. Another spectacular failure. The Eastern Mediterranean is not a morality play, it's a neighborhood. In neighborhoods, you don't erase the house next door. You figure out how to park on the same narrow street without hitting mirrors. Sometimes you leave a note, sometimes you argue over a dent, and sometimes you bring your neighbor a power cable during a blackout and realize you've been arguing with the only person who owns the one thing you needed. That is the energy lesson too. Power, literal power, likes redundancy, proximity, and reliability. So do politics. Build the interconnectors in policy the way we build them in electricity: short, robust, and with room for load spikes. Stop promising grand pipelines to nowhere. Start delivering small bridges to somewhere. Feel
This
free to subscribe and see you next time.